Welcome to Playtime with Grandpa Bob. Hi boys, today I'm going to read you a story called The First to Ride, or The First Horseman by Piers Crowell. This was written in 1959, and when I was in probably about second grade, which would have been in 1968 or 69, I remember reading this book. It was one of the first books that I bought at school, and I remember reading it and really loved it. I used to read it. I read it several times, and I even had a little library when I got a little bit older at my house. I'd organize all my books in a certain order, and then I'd made a little card catalog for myself. And here's a picture of that. And had little My Book stickers I put inside the covers of all my books. And this one, you can see this is the little library call letter I had for this book. Anyway, I want to read this book to you guys. So here goes. First to Ride, Chapter 1, Vuldar Loses a Friend. Vuldar the youth stood apart from the others with his back to the cold stone cliff. Before him were gathered the people of his tribes. Many of them drew their fur garments closely about them to hold out the chill of the night. In the midst of the larger group was a ring of strong, muscular men. These were the mightiest hunters of the clans. Their spears bristled upward. In the center of these huddled men, Vuldar could see the flames of the council fire. Its brightness seemed to exaggerate the worried expressions on the faces of the persons seated around it. No one spoke. The crackling of the fire was the only sound to come to Vuldar, who stood in the shadows. Then the boy heard a movement near him in the darkness, and he saw a tall man come from the mouth of a cave and walk slowly down among the hunters near the fire. The man's shoulders seemed to droop as he stood there in silence. Then he raised his hands and slowly spoke. "Manos is dead." The flickering flames cast light and shadow on the faces of the hunters. The news for which they had waited so long had come. A deep groan ran through the group of men, followed almost at once by the wailing of women in the caves. They had feared for the life of Manos, their leader, since the accident earlier that day. He had led them beyond the distant hills to hunt for food. Manos had been the first to sight the great woolly mammoth. For a long time they had fought with that giant, shaggy beast. In a desperate effort to end the battle, Manos had gone too close in aiming his spear. The ferocious thrust of the curving tusks had caught and pinned him down before the spears of the other hunters could stop the charge of the huge animal. The huntsmen had carried their wounded leader home on skins stretched between two poles. Then they had all gathered before the cave of Manos to await the news of his fate from Jantan, the tall one, who was his trusted friend. Jantan lifted his hands, this time to quiet the people, and spoke again. "O hunters, listen to me. Manos was a mighty leader. He took us to good hunting grounds through many seasons. He taught us how to strike the flints together to start the hot sparks. He showed us how to feed the sparks with dry moss and build them into a great fire to protect us from the beasts and cold at night. And it was he who drove the cave bears from these cliffs," put in one of the old men. Jantan nodded. "Was it not the wise Manos also who taught us to make needles from the leg bone of the stag and to sew animal skins together with sinews? These warm fur garments have shielded us well from the icy winds that sweep down from the north." "Yes," shouted one of the men. "Manos was a brave leader. He was wiser than any other man in the ways of hunting. We have never had a better leader. The loss of Manos is a great one to the whole tribe." None realized this more than Vuldar, who stood at the outer fringe of the crowd. Vuldar was too young to take a voice in the affairs of the older people, yet he had loved Manos as greatly as had the others, and he too had come to wait for the news. Manos had always been friendly to the lonely boy. He had taken the trouble to show him how to tie the stone spearheads to the wooden shafts. Often he had patiently explained to Vuldar the way to hunt the different animals. Many times Vuldar had watched intently as Manos showed him how to strip the skin from animals. The youth admired the skillful way in which the older man used a great stone knife. Later, he learned the methods of scraping the skins so that they were soft enough to make clothing. Vuldar's thoughts were interrupted as he heard Jantan's voice once more. In his last hours, Manos seemed troubled with more than the pain from the wound in his side. He was worried about the hardships of our people. While I was with him in the cave, he talked of many things. Often he spoke of the herds of fleet ones that graze on the plains below. Come now, Jantan, interrupted one of the men. What is this talk of the fleet ones? You know the rules of the tribe as well as we. The old leader is to appoint the new one before he dies. Who is to be our king now? Yes. Whom has Manos named to take his place? Asked some of the other hunters. Have patience, Jantan answered, and pay heed to what I say. Manos did not name the new leader. His command was strange. He said, and these are his own words, quote, "Gather together the men of all the tribes and give them this message from me. You shall choose for your king him who comes to you riding upon the back of a fleet one. Do not be afraid, for he will bring good fortune to you and your children." A long silence followed Manos's message. At last it was broken by one of the men at the outer edge of the ring of huntsmen. The command of Manos is strange indeed. Perhaps we should not question it, for he was wise in many ways. Yet I do not understand how this can be. Another man spoke impatiently. Of what use could the fleet ones be to us? We see them only from afar, moving faster than our swiftest runners. That is so, agreed the others. One of the hunters stood and raised his heavy spear as he spoke. How is it that one of us will ride upon the back of a fleet one? No man could get near enough to capture him alive. Vuldar listened intently to the arguments of the older men concerning the fleet ones. These graceful animals had fascinated the boy from the time he had first seen them. He loved their beautiful bodies and trim, slender legs. He was awed by their speed as they skimmed lightly over the plain. As a small child, he had often wished that he might be able to run with them to their distant pastures. The boy edged closer to the ring of hunters in order to hear them talk better. One huge hunter, called Juxtal, made his voice heard above the clamor of the others. Jantan, you know that it will not be possible to capture alive one of the fleet ones. Let us forget the will of Manos and choose a king by other means. You are now the mightiest hunter among us. You are wise in our ways of living. Also, you are the trusted friend of Manos. Why do you not become our king? The other hunters nodded their heads as they talked among themselves. They agreed with Juxtal. A man across the council fire spoke to Jantan. All of us agree that you are the right one. Put an end to this foolish idea about the fleet ones, and let us appoint you as our leader. Jantan shook his head silently when the speaker had finished. He said, "No, hunters, I will not be your king unless I can win the position fairly. I always had great faith in the wisdom of Manos when he was alive. Now that he is dead, we should respect his last command." He paused. "If you so desire," he added, "I will act as your leader until the time comes when someone among us has proved his right, through the will of Manos, to become our king." When the tall one finished speaking, he strode away from the others and disappeared into the darkness. Vuldar remained where he was until all the others had filed past him. He heard their voices as they argued, but he paid no heed to their words. He could think of nothing but the command of Manos. Chapter 2, The Fleet Ones. Early the next morning, Vuldar arose eagerly from his bed of warm animal furs. Over his shoulder, he hung a coil of stout cord braided from strips of animal hide. To his belt, he fastened a small pouch which he had filled with dried pieces of meat, as well as 2 fire-making flints. These were the only things he carried as he walked silently along the rocky path that led from his cave. In places, the path ended suddenly, and Vuldar would leap across the rocky chasms and continue on his way. After traveling a long distance, Vuldar left the high pathway of the cliffs and went down to the plain, which lay far below. When the youth's feet touched the level ground, he crouched down and crept stealthily through the tall grass. He was making his way toward the huge, weathered boulders which lay far out on the plain. Many times he had come this way in the morning sunrise, and always for the same reason. From the top of the high boulders, he could watch the fleet ones as they grazed and played. Today, though, there was a new purpose in his mind. Since he had heard the command of Manos, a thought had been growing in the mind of the boy. During the night, he had lain awake a long time thinking about the fleet ones, whom he knew so well. Their every movement was familiar, for he had taken pleasure in studying them since he was a small boy. The graceful way in which the young foals scampered on long, stiff legs had never ceased to amaze him. The fast motion of the animals and the thundering sound of their hoofs as they ran had never failed to thrill Voldar as he lay breathlessly watching, afraid to make any sound for fear he would frighten them away. He learned that their sense of smell was extremely keen and that they could hear the faintest rustle of the grass. Well did he remember the day that he clumsily sent a small pebble rolling down the rocks. Though it made only a slight noise, the stallion quickly whistled his warning as he circled the band to herd the animals together. In the next moment, he led them swiftly away from danger. Now, as Voldar moved silently through the grass, he looked carefully in every direction. When he came nearer the rocks, he suddenly stopped and dropped to his hands and knees. He had seen the fleet ones a short distance ahead of him. He knew that they had not scented him because the breeze was blowing towards Voldar, but he waited, for they might have heard or seen him. After lying very still for quite a long time, Voldar slowly raised himself up until only the top of his head and his eyes were above the grass. The fleet ones were still there and did not know he was near. Crouching lower, Voldar moved very slowly around the place where the animals grazed. He approached the rocks from the other side. Carefully, he climbed up, using the rough rocks for handholds. At the top, he wriggled forward on his stomach until he could see the fleet ones below. The youth looked fully at each animal in the band. In his years of watching the fleet ones, Voldar had grown to know them all. He had studied the different animals and had given them names that seemed to fit each one. There was a young mare he called North Wind. She always wanted to be alone and was not so friendly as the rest. Another, standing in deep grass near the band, was the one Voldar called Old Hungry One. As usual, she was eating as fast as she could. A third mare, Yellowtail, had a new little colt by her side this morning. Voldar knew that the baby was only a few hours old, for he was very wobbly in his long, awkward legs. The softness of his hair gave him a fluffy appearance. He continually butted his little round forehead into the mare's sides, trying to find his dinner. As if he had saved the best until last, Voldar finally let his eyes come to rest on the great black stallion, who stood a distance away on a higher piece of ground, guarding the others. His head was held high. First he would look in one direction and then in another. No vicious animal could get near the band without his sensing it. The stallion had always interested Voldar more than the others. The youth had watched him 5 years now. He had first seen him when he was a little black colt. Each day he grew faster and faster until now he was a full-grown animal. Voldar called him Fleet Black, for he was different than the others. While they were all yellow like the dry grass in the summer, he was as black as the inside of Voldar's cave at night. The sun gleamed on his dark coat. His mane and tail were long and flowing, and his flashing eyes looked out sharply through the forelock, which reached almost to his nose. Fleet Black's head was beautifully shaped, and his neck was long and graceful. His slender but powerful legs could carry him very fast across the plain. Voldar had been there in his hiding place on the boulders the day that Fleet Black had fought Big Thunder, the old leader of the band. Whirling and kicking, they had knocked each other to the ground as they came together with mouths wide open, trying to crush each other's bones with their teeth. The terrible snapping sound had made the boy shudder. Voldar had been afraid that Big Thunder would kill Fleet Black with his powerful jaws. After what seemed a long, long time to Voldar, the older stallion's strength ebbed away and the strong young stallion had won the battle. From that time on, Fleet Black was the new leader of the band of mares and colts. Today, the black stallion seemed to be more nervous than usual. He blew air through his nostrils in loud snorts. Very often he pawed the ground with a forefoot. Voldar could not understand why Fleet Black was making such a fuss. Then, looking down from his better position, he suddenly saw a large black wolf creeping through the grass toward the new little colt that now lay sleeping in the sun by Yellowtail's feet. Fleet Black only sensed the presence of the wolf, but he had not yet seen it. Vuldar wanted to cry out a warning, but he realized the sound of his voice would only confuse the stallion. Instead, he lay silently while the wolf slowly crept closer to Yellowtail's baby. By this time, Fleet Black had started to circle the band. He moved slowly, lifting each foot high and setting it down lightly. His neck was curved and his nostrils were wide. He was trying to locate the unseen danger. All at once, the stealthy prowler leaped toward the sleeping colt. Fleet Black excitedly neighed a warning to his band and with the speed of lightning ran to cut off the advance of the attacking wolf. Vuldar raised himself to his hands and knees in his excitement. One more jump would have carried the snarling animal to the helpless colt. Then a lashing black forefoot struck the wolf's shoulder, and he went spinning and rolling away. Before the enraged stallion could reach him again, the yelping wolf limped crazily through the tall grass and escaped. Vuldar was afraid that the Fleet Ones would leave the place because of the wolf's attack. If they did, it might be many days before he could try his plan. Fleet Black, with his black tail held high, herded the frightened Fleet Ones away from the rocks out into the open plain. As the youth watched the animals, all except the stallion gradually became less nervous and soon dropped to their noses to the ground and began busily eating again. The youth, too, felt hungry. He took from his pouch several pieces of the dried meat and ate them slowly as he watched the distant Fleet Ones. Again and again he went over in his mind the plan which he had formed. He knew that when the sun slanted the shadow of the rocks in a certain direction, the animals would return to the far side for water. Within the rocks bubbled a spring of pure, cold water, which trickled into a large basin of small stones and pebbles. To get back to the basin of water, the Fleet Ones would have to go single file under a ledge of rocks, which formed a natural stone bridge above the pathway. When the shadow of the rocks was in the right direction, Vuldar made his way to this stone bridge. He knew from the actions of Fleet Black that the stallion would soon lead the mares and the colts to the rocks, where he would let them go ahead of him to drink first. Many times Vuldar had watched while the stallion stayed beyond the rocks to guard the opening in case of danger. After the mares had finished, Fleet Black would go to the water alone and quickly drink his fill. It was well that Vuldar was ready, for he now heard the clip-clop of many hooves on the rocky path, and as he looked below, he could see the fat mares and the little colts going under the high perch. Then came the familiar sound of splashing water. After they had drunk, he heard them pawing in the water basin, and then they came back and went out to the grassy plain. When Fleet Black passed under the bridge, Vuldar watched breathlessly. The stallion's ears pointed first this way and then that. The youth was close enough to see plainly the powerful muscles that rippled beneath the black coat. After a few moments, the stallion finished drinking, and Vuldar heard the clatter of returning hooves on the stony path. Quickly and silently, he rose to a crouching position. The youth's excited pulse pounded at his temples. Then he leaped to the stallion's back and gripped the black mane with both hands. The leader of the Fleet Ones screamed piercingly as he reared high, pawing the air frantically. With the speed of the wind, he lunged forward and started to run in long, leaping bounds, terrified of this strange weight on his back. Then he stopped suddenly and put his head down and bucked and kicked high into the air until Vuldar thought he would surely be thrown off. It did not matter how much he twisted or turned, the animal could rid himself of neither the hands clinging to his black mane, nor the legs rigidly clasping his trembling sides. Chapter 3, Vuldar, the First Horseman. Vuldar was as frightened as the animal on whose back he rode. As the black one lengthened his stride, the boy found it difficult to breathe. It seemed that the air moved past his face so fast that none could enter his nostrils. The wind whipped into his eyes so hard that it brought great tears. Many times he thought he would fall when the black turned quickly and went in a different direction. Yet Vuldar was brave, and his courage made him strong, and he knew that he must not fall because the mares running close behind would surely trample him. Fleet Black galloped faster and faster until the slower mares were gradually left behind. Now they were moving in a straight line. Voldar could see that he was being carried away from the cliffs where he lived. He could neither guide nor turn the fleet one. Glancing down, Voldar saw their gray shadow silently sliding over the ground at such speed that the grass blurred in his vision. The youth realized that nothing except the gliding shadow could match the speed of the great stallion. If men could ride the fleet ones while they hunted, thought Voldar, even the mammoth's quick charge could not overtake them. At last, after running a great distance, Fleet Black's strength began to leave him. His black body was covered with white foam, and his wet coat glistened in the sun. Voldar noticed that he ran more slowly and was glad, for he too was growing weak. He was afraid that he would not be able to cling to the animal's back much longer. As they reached the forest, Voldar unclasped one of his hands from the black mane. The fingers were stiff, as if frozen by the north wind in the winter. When at last he could move his fingers, Voldar took the cord from his shoulder and threw one end under and over the neck of Fleet Black, and laboriously tied a knot with his free hand. Gradually, the animal's gallop slowed to a trot, and then to a walk as they passed among the trees. The stallion's sides heaved from labored breathing. Now, in the moment of Fleet Black's weakness, the time had come for the next step in Voldar's plan. As the pair passed a strong tree, the youth quickly threw the free end of his braided cord with such force that wrapped twice around the trunk. Voldar jumped down from the back of the fleet one and with nimble fingers quickly tied a knot as he shielded himself behind the large tree. With his remaining strength, the tired animal attempted to bite through the cord which held him. He reared and kicked at the tree in his anger. The bushes were lashed and the ground torn up by the wild stallion's sharp hooves. Voldar watched fearfully from a safe distance as the great stallion struggled to free himself. He was not sure that the braid would be strong enough to hold the frantic animal. It creaked loudly on the tree trunk as Fleet Black pulled against it, but the cord that Voldar had braided so carefully was strong, and the black one was too tired to fight long. Voldar was greatly relieved when at last Fleet Black hung his head low in defeat. Then the boy went a short distance away. Kneeling down, he began picking up sticks and leaves and laying them aside until at last he had cleared a spot of bare ground. A fire would keep vicious animals away from him and Fleet Black while they rested. Not far away, he found some dry moss and twigs. He placed the bits of moss on the spot he had cleared. Then he took the fire-making flints from his belt pouch. With his hands close to the moss, he struck the flints rapidly together. There was a grating sound, and then a shower of sparks flew from the hard, rough stones. Some of these fell into the moss, and soon a few thin wisps of smoke began to twist upward. Voldar quickly laid the flints aside and, bending low, shielded the moss with his hands, blowing on it gently. It was not long until a small flame burst up. Upon this, he hastily placed a few of the small dried twigs, and as the flame grew, he added larger pieces of wood until he had a crackling fire. When the bright flames leaped up, Fleet Black's eyes gleamed in the light, and he snorted. He was terrified. He circled through the brush wildly to the far side of the tree, putting as much distance as the braid would allow him between himself and the fire. Again and again he strained at the cord which held him. Voldar spoke softly to the animal. "Do not be afraid, Fleet Black. The fire will not harm you." Though the animal did not understand Voldar's repeated words, he gradually became quiet. Voldar laid himself down on the leaves in front of the fire where he could watch the stallion. He rested his tired, aching body while he had the opportunity, for he knew that he must again ride the stallion and that this would take all the strength he had. As he lay there, Voldar fell into a troubled sleep, filled with wild dreams of riding Fleet Black. He was suddenly awakened from his dreams by a loud snorting sound. Some prowling animal had frightened the black stallion, and he was furiously pawing the ground with a forefoot. Voldar built up the fire, which was almost out, and remained on guard until the morning sun rose. So the youth was both hungry and thirsty, but he could not take the time to eat or to search for water. The great stallion was becoming restless. Voldar knew that he must now try the next part of his plan. He arose and walked toward Fleet Black. The stallion trembled as he watched the boy. His nostrils flared open in suspicion. Voldar was wise enough not to go within striking distance of Fleet Black's forefeet. Many times he had seen them break the bones of prowling animals that had come to prey on the fleet ones. Next to the tree to which Fleet Black was tied stood another tree with low-hanging branches. Up into this tree Voldar climbed. Not wishing to frighten the stallion more than necessary, he worked his way cautiously through the limbs to Fleet Black's tree. Letting himself down the trunk, he finally could reach the loose end of the cord where the knot was formed. His next move would be extremely dangerous. He must leap again to the back of the stallion, and if he failed, he would have no second chance. To fall near the hoofs of the black one would certainly mean death. As soon as there was a favorable moment, Voldar leaped down. When he felt the animal's sides between his legs, he gripped as hard as he could and pulled the braid loose. He let go of the fleet one's mane with one hand to grasp the lashing braid, intending to pull it to him so that it would not tangle on the trees. With his head turned to the side, he did not see the low branch hanging above the path. As Fleet Black ran under it, the limb suddenly struck Voldar sharply across his chest, and losing his balance, he slid down to Fleet Black's side. The youth clung desperately with one leg hooked around the back of Fleet Black. Frantically, he attempted to regain his hold of the mane. The black galloped faster, frightened by the boy's position on his side. With a mighty effort, Voldar grasped the flying mane with one hand. His chest pained from the blow he had received. He felt as if he did not have the strength left to hold on. As they went on, the boy slipped farther from the stallion's back. Voldar knew that he must not give up now, or he would lose Fleet Black forever. This thought gave him new strength, and he was able to snatch the black mane with his other hand. Now, slowly, he pulled himself up. His muscles stood out as he struggled. Each time the fleet one jumped over a fallen log, the boy slipped back again. The bushes of the forest whipped at his back, but gradually he drew himself up until finally he was again in a sitting position. Voldar's arms ached and his breath came in quick gasps. He did not again attempt to grasp the free end of the cord until they had passed through the thicker part of the forest where there were many low branches. Now, as the stallion ran on, Voldar noticed that they were headed back down toward the open plain that they had left the day before. When Fleet Black's feet touched the flat stretch of plain, he lengthened his stride until the pounding hooves sounded like thunder to the ears of the youth. Though his muscles were painfully sore, Voldar felt safer now. He had learned how to balance himself. It was easier to ride the stallion's rapid forward motion on the open plain, where there were no trees in their path. In the forest, Voldar had noticed that as he reached out for the loose end of the cord, Fleet Black had turned his head away from his hand. As he turned his nose, the stallion's body had also turned, and his directions had been changed. Voldar tried this again. When he reached out with his right hand, the black turned to the left and went in a large circle. When the youth reached out his left hand, the stallion turned in the opposite direction. Voldar was overjoyed, for in this way he could, to a certain extent, guide the fleet one. Another thing that Voldar noticed was that as the animal ran, his nose was pointed forward. If there were some way in which the nose of Fleet Black could be pulled back, thought the youth, perhaps he would run more slowly. Voldar threw the slack of the rope forward, causing a loop to form. After many attempts, one of the loops wrapped around the nose of the running stallion, with one end of the braid around the animal's throat, and the loop around his nose. A crude guide line was formed. This left a single line going back to Voldar's hand. When the boy pulled back on the nose of Fleet Black, the animal lessened his speed. So Voldar and his fleet one made their way back to the place they had left the day before, where the clear water bubbled forth from the large rocks on the open plain. The stallion was very thirsty. He splashed into the pool and drank with his nose deep in the cold water. Voldar was as thirsty as Fleet Black, but he dared not dismount. He hoped to guide the black to a hiding place high in the cliffs near the caves of his people. There, he might be able to tie him as he had done the day before. When they started out again, the youth was better able to guide the wild stallion. Fleet Black seemed to have lost his great fear of Voldar. He was still nervous because of the strangeness of the boy upon his back and the braid on his head, but he had become used to his rider and apparently knew that the youth did not mean to harm him. Voldar's feeling for Fleet Black was one of awe and admiration. If he could tame the black one, he knew that he would become a most useful companion. Voldar's legs would never grow tired from walking. He would be able to go a greater distance in one day than the tribesmen could travel on foot in many days. He guided the galloping stallion across the plain to the base of the stone cliffs, where high above his tribespeople lived. At first, Fleet Black did not wish to go up where Voldar guided him. Several times he snorted and whirled to go back onto the open, flat plain. Each time, though, the youth raised his hand and turned him back to the rocky path. At last, the stallion did as the boy wished, and they climbed upward until they reached the high trail which Voldar had traveled on foot the day before. Between them and the caves where the people lived was an old pathway that led back into a deep canyon. Voldar had often walked there when he wanted to be alone. None of the other tribesmen went there, and Voldar was sure it would be a good place in which None of the other tribesmen went there, and Voldar was sure it would be a good place in which to hide the stallion. He wished, for a time at least, to keep Fleet Black a secret from the others. So now he turned the black off the main trail and into the large canyon. Deeper and deeper they went, down through the quiet, leafy forest. The fleet one moved more slowly because this was a strange place to him. He picked his way carefully. His ears pointed straight forward as he looked and sniffed suspiciously at every tree and bush before passing it. Finally, the stallion went through a crevice so narrow that it brushed Voldar's legs on each side. Beyond this passageway was an open space, completely surrounded by rock cliffs. A small stream of water trickled from one of the stone walls, and only a few trees grew from the grassy floor. It was like a huge cave, except that there was no top, and when Voldar looked up, he could see a small patch of blue sky high above. This tiny canyon was to be Fleet Black's new home. As this was the end of their journey, Voldar again tied the fleet one to a tree in the same way as he had done the day before. This time, realizing the animal's need for food, the youth pulled tufts of grass and piled them high near the trunk of the tree. Then the tired boy lay down a short distance away to admire his prize. If Fleet Black had suddenly disappeared, he would not have been surprised, for the exciting things that had happened since yesterday hardly seemed real. After a long time, Voldar realized that his body, too, needed food and rest. There was one more task that he must do before leaving the stallion for the night. He tugged and pulled large branches until he had covered the narrow crevice in the rocks. Now, he said to himself, no one will be able to see Fleet Black, and the wild animals cannot get in to bother him. Voldar's spirit was high as he made his way through the darkness to the cave of his people. He hoped they would not ask him what he had been doing and why he had been gone so long. Chapter 4, The Training of Fleet Black. The days that followed were exciting ones to Voldar. Each morning he would get up eagerly. Upon leaving the cave, he would travel a roundabout path to the small hidden canyon, for he did not wish the older tribesmen to discover his secret. He knew that each day the hunters spent much time trying to capture the fleet ones in an effort to fulfill the command of Manos. Fleet Black would have been an easy prize for the men if they found him helplessly tied to the tree. Voldar was always careful, therefore, to see that no one followed him. When he returned to his cave each night, he carried with him a skin pouch filled with roots and nuts or fresh berries to show that he had been busy with some useful task during the day. Otherwise, he might have been questioned. When he reached the small canyon, Voldar's first duty was always to pull many tufts of grass and pile them near Fleet Black. Then he filled the heavy skin pouch with water from the little stream and placed it near the tree to which the stallion was tethered. When he had finished doing these things, he would lie down and watch the animal eat hungrily. Sometimes he would speak in soft tones. Gradually, Fleet Black learned that the youth was a friend who brought him food and water. As the stallion finally lost his fear in the presence of the boy, he seemed to look forward to Voldar's arrival each morning. Not many days had passed before he began to greet Voldar with nickering sounds when the boy arrived at the crevice. The stallion was still fiery and alert, but a strong feeling of companionship grew between the two. As time went on, Voldar knew that he must, in some way, tame the wild stallion. He must teach Fleet Black to obey him. Unless the animal could be controlled, it would be better to free him. He must find a safe way to climb on his back. He wished that he could lead the animal to the nearby stream instead of carrying water in the leaky skin pouch. One morning, as the boy was carrying water to the stallion, he tripped over a root and sprawled flat on the ground. He was dangerously near the front feet of the black. As he fell, he heard the animal snort, startled by the sudden movement. Voldar instinctively covered his head with his hands, for he expected Fleet Black to strike him. Then, instead of a blow, Voldar felt the hot breath of the stallion upon his neck as he lay there. The stallion was nuzzling the boy curiously. Voldar's fear turned to joy. He knew that the stallion was no longer afraid, but wished to be friendly. Slowly he arose and cautiously extended the back of his hand toward the nose of the stallion. The great black trembled and his nostrils quivered, but he did not back away. Voldar gently rubbed the soft nose, talking in a low voice. The ears of the animal pointed forward, and his wide eyes watched every movement. No hand had ever touched him in this way before. His legs were braced. He was ready to whirl and kick. Moments passed, and gradually the black one relaxed. He had learned the boy's hands would not hurt him. After a few days, Voldar was able to touch Fleet Black on any part of his body. Using the tree as a shield at first, the boy rubbed his head and neck and slid his hands over the animal's back and down his legs. Then patiently, the boy placed the loop over the animal's nose many times and practiced tying other cords to his neck. At last, Voldar felt ready to teach the animal to lead. That day, he brought with him an extra long braid which he tied around the throat of Fleet Black. Then he made a loop around the nose and knotted it securely. At first, he did not untie the animal from the tree. He knew that if the black became frightened, he could easily jerk away from him. Then began the first lesson in leading. Voldar stood in front of Fleet Black and pulled on the cord. Fleet Black braced his legs and refused to move, no matter how hard Voldar pulled. Finally, the boy struck upon the idea of holding a handful of grass in front of the black's nose. As the animal walked forward a few steps to get the food, Voldar pulled gently at the cord. After a long time, the boy could lead Fleet Black around and around the tree without using the grass to lure him. At last, Voldar risked untying the cord which held Fleet Black to the tree. When the powerful stallion was led away from the tree into the open, he apparently thought that he was free. Rearing high, he whirled and started to run. The length of cord rapidly burned through Voldar's clenched hands. The boy braced with all his strength and pulled to the side. The pressure upon the stallion's nose permitted him to run only in a large circle around his master. During the days that Fleet Black had been tied to the tree, his muscles had rested. Now he was eager to run and exercise. He leaped into the air, he walked on his hind legs, and then plunged and kicked wildly. Often his swift bursts of speed dragged the boy around the enclosure, but always he was forced to run in a circle at the end of the braided cord. In the past, Voldar had observed that the stallion had a keen memory. He hoped to use this to his advantage. Slowly, he worked the circling animal back to the tree. Then, as he spoke a word, he tied the braid to the trunk. After this had been done many times, the animal learned that when the word was spoken, he must stop. Voldar had taught Fleet Black to halt at the spoken word. Next, Voldar taught Fleet Black to stand while he mounted. He would hold toward him a handful of choice grass, and while the animal turned his head to eat, the boy would grasp his mane and leap to his back. When Fleet Black first felt the weight of the boy, he pranced with nervousness. Voldar had not been upon his back since he had captured him many days before. Now, while he was mounted, Voldar reached forward and untied the braid from the tree trunk. As the stallion moved forward, he frisked playfully, but the boy clung to his back. The stallion ran swiftly around the small hidden canyon, leaping over boulders and darting among the trees. If there were a sure way of guiding him, said Voldar to himself. Thinking back, he remembered how Fleet Black had turned away from his hand and how the stallion's body had turned when he held his head to the side. Then the boy hit upon a plan. Dismounting, he attached 2 short cords to the loop around Fleet Black's nose, one on each side. With these, Voldar could pull the animal's head either to the left or to the right. At first, the great stallion fought against the pressure, but after a few days of practice, he would obey the slightest touch upon the sidelines of the braided cord. Now Voldar could turn the stallion quickly as they sped over the floor of the small canyon. Voldar made another discovery. With 2 lines from the nose instead of just a single cord, he could slow the speed of his mount by a steady backward pull. The boy learned to balance his weight and lean with the black in making the short turns. By pressing his opposite knees against the side of the animal, he could help in the turning. Quite by accident, he learned that when he grasped with his legs, Fleet Black would move forward faster. When his rider pulled back with the lines or pressed his heels into the animal's sides, Fleet Black could be signaled to go forward at a slow or fast pace, whichever Voldar desired. Next chapter, The Rivals. One day, as the season was nearing its end, Voldar took all the branches away from the mouth of the small canyon and rode the stallion down the long, steep path from the high cliffs. Out on the flat plain, they raced toward the weathered boulders where Fleet Black had first been captured. No man before Voldar had heard the music of the wind as it rushed away from the striding gait of a stallion. No man before had controlled any of the fleet ones. Voldar was filled with happiness because at last he had mastered the wild-spirited Fleet Black. Again they went under the natural stone bridge to the spring of water where the wild fleet ones drank. This time Voldar jumped down from the back of Fleet Black. Holding to one of the lines, he lay face downward and drank from the rocky pool with the stallion. After they had drunk, Voldar led the stallion away from the rocks. Sitting down in the grass, he let the animal graze at the end of the cord. From the pouch at his belt, the boy took a few pieces of dried meat and some roots, for he too was hungry. The warm sun upon Voldar's back was very relaxing. He did not go to sleep, but he grew drowsy as he sat munching his food and thinking about the adventures that he and the Black could have together. There were many distant places that they could see. None of the vicious beasts could overtake him if he were riding upon Fleet Black. The far blue hills had always lured the boy, but the distance was too far and the danger too great for a lone boy to travel on foot. Fleet Black could safely take him there and back in less than a day. Suddenly a startled snort interrupted Voldar's daydreams, and the cord was almost jerked from his hand as the stallion raised his head. The animal dragged the boy a few steps through the grass. Quickly Voldar rose to see what had caused the stallion's movement. While they had been resting, the wild band of fleet ones had come to the rocks to drink. Voldar thought he would not be able to hold the leaping Fleet Black. It took all his strength to work hand over hand to the stallion, who was neighing anxiously to the mares. When Voldar spoke the word to halt, the Black hesitated, trembling with excitement, but obeyed. In an instant, the boy leaped to his back, where he felt better able to control the prancing Black. What he had not counted on was the yellow stallion that now left the other fleet ones and approached Voldar's mount. Black legs and mane and tail marked the vicious-looking animal, and a black stripe ran down the middle of his yellow back and into his tail. His powerful jaws were long and bony, and his dark eyes flashed hate at Fleet Black. This stallion was now the leader of the herd. He meant to fight the Black if necessary to keep his position. Fleet Black tossed his head and pawed the ground in eagerness to get at the yellow fleet one who stood between him and his band. Fear gripped Voldar. He did not know whether to slide down from Fleet Black and free him, or to stay on his mount and risk a fight between the 2 stallions. His mind worked desperately to find some way to escape the danger without giving up Fleet Black. Then he noticed that the mares were shifting nervously around and around while the little foals huddled to their sides in fear. Even the bold yellow stallion seemed to hesitate as he approached. All at once, Voldar realized that the animals feared the strangeness of the human presence. A plan of action leaped into the boy's mind. Pulling hard with his right hand, he turned Fleet Black away from the menacing stallion. Then, leaning low over the neck of his mount, he dug his heel sharply into the animal's sides. Fleet Black plunged forward, around the yellow one, toward the mares. The boy waved his arms and screamed and shouted as loud as he could. In an instant, all was confusion. The fleet ones scattered in every direction. The little foals neighed excitedly as they called out for their mothers. Voldar drove Fleet Black through the middle of the herd, and his feet kicked harder and harder into the stallion's flanks. Like a great spear shaft, they went straight on, brushing aside the fleet ones. The yellow stallion whirled around and tried to chase them, but he was hopelessly blocked by the bewildered mares and colts. The speed of Fleet Black carried him beyond the band. Each time he tried to stop, Voldar struck his heels against his ribs, and when he tried to turn back, Voldar's strong arms kept guiding him away. Even though the great stallion was breathing hard from his run, the boy did not allow him to slow up or stop until he had crossed the plain and finally come to the base of the high stone cliffs. Fleet Black whinnied shrilly as he looked back to the plain, but they had put a great distance behind them, and the fleet ones were nowhere in sight. Before starting up the stony path, Voldar let Fleet Black rest a while. The animal's body was dripping with sweat, and lather showed white on his dark, wet coat. His sides heaved with rapid breathing for a long time. Voldar too was breathing hard, excited by his narrow escape. Much later, lost in his thoughts, Voldar walked back to the path that led along the sides of the cliffs toward his cave. He had worked hard to place a huge pile of grass before Fleet Black so that he would not become hungry before the night was through. Carefully, the boy had concealed the crevice in the rocks with leafy branches before starting homeward. In the twilight, Voldar did not see the shadowy figure of the man who stepped into the trail ahead of him. Waiting until the boy was quite near, the man spoke. "Well now, Voldar, what keeps a boy as young as you away from his cave so late?" The startled Voldar could not speak at first. He recognized the man as Buljan, one of the mightiest hunters of the tribes. Buljan's powerfully built body was clothed in the skin of Longtooth the lion. Any man who wore the skin of Longtooth could boast of his great skill and bravery as a hunter. Stuck in his belt was a long, jagged flint knife, and he carried a long spear. Voldar respected the bravery of Buljan the hunter, but he also knew that the man could be cruel and mean to the weaker ones of the tribes. He was not well liked by the other hunters. They did not trust him and his selfish ways. It was said that Buljan often claimed as his own the animals that had fallen from the spears of other hunters. Few men dared dispute with him when he took the choice meat of the animals. "Speak up, boy," Buljan commanded harshly. "Are you not afraid that some hungry animal will pounce upon you from out of the evening darkness?" He laid a heavy hand on the boy's arm. "Where have you been this day, and why do you carry that long length of strongly braided cord?" Voldar did not know how near Buljan had been to his hidden canyon. He was afraid the hunter might have seen him riding the black when he came from the plain earlier that day. The boy pointed to the pouch which hung by a strap from his shoulder. He tried to make his voice sound casual. "I've been gathering red shell nuts that have fallen early this season. The cord I have used to climb the higher branches of the red shell nut trees so that I might shake down some of the larger nuts." The big huntsman reached roughly into Voldar's bag and helped himself to a handful of the nuts. As they walked along, he cracked the hard shells noisily with his powerful jaws. "You must show me where you found these sometime," said the burly man. "They are sweet to my taste. I am hungry. All day I have hunted the fleet ones that graze on the plain below. It is impossible to catch such speedy creatures." At Buljan's next words, Voldar's heart nearly stopped beating. "You haven't seen any of the fleet ones up here, have you, boy?" Voldar answered quickly, "You know that the fleet ones have left the higher lands for this season. Besides, none of them has ever come to these high cliffs, even during the warmest weather." "I know all that, Voldar," said Buljan impatiently. "But earlier this day, as I came up from the plain below, I thought I heard faintly the sound of a fleet one's hoofs on the rocks high above me." The boy's voice was calm, but Voldar was afraid. "Did you see the animal, Buljan?" "No, I did not. By the time I could reach a high point where I could see, there was nothing in sight." Relieved by this information, Voldar said, "It might have been the footsteps of the great elk that you heard." "It might have been," said Buljan, "but there is a difference in the sounds. This had the ring of a solid hoof, which is unlike the sound of the two toes of the elk." Buljan's next words put new fear into Voldar's heart. "The day after tomorrow, I will hunt this place thoroughly," the hunter announced. "And if there are any fleet ones near here, I will see their tracks and find them. I would do it tomorrow, but for the important meeting of the hunters. Some of us are growing tired of waiting for a new king. We have decided that it is foolish to listen to Jantan, the tall one, any longer. The command of Manos was impossible from the beginning. Who knows, bragged the hunter, perhaps I, the great Buljan, might be your next king. When they reached the caves and separated for the night, Voldar's heart was heavy. The crafty hunter would surely find Fleet Black when he saw his tracks. He knew that the cruel Buljan would take the stallion from a mere boy such as he. If there were some other place to which he could take the fleet one, he might save him. Then Voldar realized dismally that once Buljan found Fleet Black's tracks, he would follow them wherever they might go. Next chapter, who will be king? True to the words of Buljan, the men of all the tribes began gathering the next morning for a meeting. Once more they were seated before the cave of Manos, who had now been dead almost one full season. Since the passing of their leader, the usual customs of the tribes had been neglected. The mightiest men of each clan had tried to capture the cunning fleet ones, but these hunters had not grown to know and love the fleet ones as Voldar had. They had always killed the animals they hunted. If they did not use the stone-headed spears, they dug deep pits into which the animals fell and pierced themselves on the sharp poles placed there. Sometimes the hunters fixed traps by bending the tops of springy trees down over the trails. To these they attached cords with loops in them so that the passing animals were jerked up by the necks and their life was choked out. In trying to capture the fleet ones alive, they had built crude enclosures of brush and sticks into which they had hoped to drive the fleet ones. They had laid snares of braided strips of skin at the watering places. All these attempts had failed. The sharp senses of the hunted fleet ones had warned them of the men's plans to trap them. From a distance, Voldar listened to the talk of the men seated in the circle. Very early this morning, he had gone to the secret canyon to give food and water to the stallion so he could return in time to learn the decision of the men. He was relieved to see that Buljan sat among the other hunters. He knew that while the man was there, Fleet Black would be safe, for a time at least. From the sound of their voices, Voldar knew that the hunters were unhappy. At times they were loud with anger as they argued. There were a few who still thought Manos's will should be respected. Voldar did not come closer, for the older men would have resented the presence of a boy at their council circle. As he strained his ears to hear every word, Jantan the Tall One arose to speak. "Again we have come to this place before the cave," said he, "and I am sorry that no man has been able to carry out the command of Manos." Angry voices rose up from the circle of men, and one was louder than the rest. "Certainly no hunter is so great as to capture one of the fleet ones and make himself king." Another of the hunters shouted, "We have all neglected the hunger of our families and the customary order of our hunting to chase stupidly after that which we knew we could not capture." With difficulty, Voldar restrained himself from crying out. He was afraid that the older men of the tribes would ridicule him if he told them that it was possible to capture and ride one of the fleet ones. And he was afraid that if he told his story, Fleet Black would be taken from him. Voldar's greatest wish was that he might keep the black one as his own. It did not occur to him that he might become the leader of these men. The clamor within the circle became louder. "Jantan," shouted one, "surely you know by now that we must select a leader and forget the impossible command of Manos." Another hunter arose, as he spoke to Jantan, he struck the rocks with his spear shaft. "Our people must have a leader," he said. "We have respected you and followed you this past season, but it is not as if you are our king. We cannot risk hunger any longer. The cold season will soon be upon us. We need someone to lead us to the great hunting grounds to the east. We should be filling our caves with food. If it is not done soon, we will starve. I say it is our duty to select a new king here and now." Jantan arose again. Even from a distance, Voldar could see that the tall man was sad. When Jantan spoke, there was a note of apparent defeat in his voice. "I had hoped that the will of the great Manos might be carried out," he said. "His wisdom brought to this people many good things." Holding up his hands for silence from the crowd, Jantan continued, "I know it is a difficult thing that he has commanded. Perhaps it is impossible, as some of you think, for any man to capture and ride upon a fleet one." "Yes," exclaimed one of the elders, "we have all tried to catch the animals. It cannot be done. Let us now select a king in some different way." Jantan answered slowly, "Then, if that is the wish of all the huntsmen, I cannot refuse your request. Is there any man among you who you would make your king?" Remembering Buljan's boast, Voldar now looked at the spot where the huge man sat. One of Buljan's friends sprang quickly to his feet. "There is one hunter here who is stronger than the rest," he said, "and we cannot deny his bravery, for he wears the fur of Longtooth, the lion. He is always foremost with his spear when we kill the bison. So great is his strength that he alone can carry upon his back the body of Flathorn the deer." With a sweep of his arm, the speaker pointed to Buljan. "There is the man to become our king, Buljan, the mightiest hunter of all." A few men around the circle shouted, "Yes, we want Buljan." Voldar noticed, though, that many of the hunters shook their heads in disagreement. They did not trust the selfish one. But from the look on their faces, Voldar could see that they dared not speak against him. Jantan waited a moment and then said, "The hunter Buljan has been named. Is it the will of all that he should be our leader?" Before anyone could speak, their attention was attracted to a running man who shouted up from the lower plain. The hunters knew that he brought important news because he waved his arms in a frantic salute before he came near enough to speak. When at last he had scrambled up the steep cliff, it was difficult for him to talk. He gasped for breath, and the men could see that he had run a long way. "At last, the head man of my tribe has captured a fleet one," he panted. "I have been sent ahead to bring you the news." The hunters questioned the man eagerly. Voldar's heart sank. He knew the man had approached from the plain, but had these men found Fleet Black, and were they bringing him here? Because they do not know how to control him, thought Voldar, he will surely hurt them and escape. As he listened to what the tired man said, Voldar's mind was relieved. The fleet one they had caught was a mare. The hunters had come upon her bogged down in the sticky mud of the great swamp to the south. They had thrown their cords about her neck and had dragged her to solid ground. The fleet one, the messenger told them, was weak from struggling in the mud, and it would not be until the next day that they could bring her to the village of caves. Voldar was among the tribespeople who gathered early the next morning. They awaited the arrival of the man who was bringing with him the fleet one. Finally, as the sun rose higher, 2 men and the mare were seen slowly approaching on the flat land below. A number of the men went down to meet them. Voldar was joyous that the wishes of Manos were about to be fulfilled. No one knew better than the boy how valuable the fleet ones could be to the people, and now he could keep Fleet Black for his own. As the men and the animal moved closer, Voldar was disappointed at what he saw. The messenger had been truthful. The men did bring with them one of the fleet ones, but Voldar could see that she was sick and weak with age. The bones of her sides showed plainly under the leathery skin. No strong muscles bulged at her shoulders like Fleet Black's. Neither did her master ride upon her back. Instead, he walked in front of the ancient mare, pulling upon her thin neck with a cord. The headman's companion walked behind, a stick in his hand with which he kept striking the animal to make her tired legs move forward. Voldar had seen many a poor old mare like her drop behind the band of fleet ones, unable to travel with them as they galloped over the grasslands. If the other tribesmen noticed the things that Voldar saw, they did not speak about them. They were anxious to proclaim the newly arrived tribesman their leader and be done with it. They did not care for the fleet one. They had never seen value in the animals as Voldar had. They wished to forget the fleet ones so they could get back to their regular custom of hunting and living. As Voldar looked from one face to another, he saw that most of the men felt the same. On Jantan's face, however, was a look of great disappointment. He must have noticed the same things that Voldar had, but the tall one said nothing. He turned and walked slowly away from the crowd. Then Voldar ran to Jantan and cried out, "O sire, surely this cannot be the sign of which the mighty Manos spoke. This man does not ride upon the back of the fleet one, and the mare is old and without spirit." "No, Voldar," replied Jantan, "this is not what Manos desired, but the people wish to get back to their old ways of hunting." Jantan placed his hand on the boy's suntanned shoulder. "You are but a boy, Voldar, and should not worry yourself with the affairs of the older men." "It is true I am not yet a grown man," said Voldar, "but I think I understand the meaning of Manos' will. Always have I loved the fleet ones. In my dreams I have seen their value." "I am sorry," said Jantan, "but dreams are not enough. There will be other men who will someday find a way to use the fleet ones." Then before Voldar could stop himself, he blurted forth the secret that had burned within him for many days. "I do not dream now, Jantan," he said. Beyond these distant cliffs, where I have hidden him, stands the mightiest stallion of all the fleet ones. Fleet Black I have named him. I ride him over the plain each day, and he obeys my wishes." Jantan's expression was one of both amazement and disbelief. Then, as he realized the seriousness of the boy's words, he grasped Voldar as if to shake him. "You still dream, Voldar, for what you say cannot be true." The boy's face reddened with excitement as he replied, "I speak the truth, Tall One. I go now, but I shall return before the cliff's shadow falls upon this spot. I will ride my fleet one among you, and you shall see that he obeys me." "Go," said Jantan excitedly, "and prove what you say. I will keep the tribesmen busy making ready for the feast, but no king shall be named until the shadow falls on this spot." Voldar hesitated. "Promise me, Jantan, that none shall take this fleet one from me, for he is mine forever, and I belong as much to him." "If you can ride the fleet one as you say, you will have no cause to fear that it will be taken from you." Without another word, Voldar turned and fled toward the silent cliffs. Next chapter, Fleet Black meets the tribes. As Voldar's feet moved along the familiar path, his mind was troubled. Now that the time had come to make known his secret, he felt weak. He had realized from the first that sooner or later the day would arrive when others would see the stallion and want him for themselves. What one man owned, another might force from him. Brute strength was the law. The only sounds that came to Voldar's ears were the flutterings of birds as they flew among the branches ahead of him. When he pulled away the branches at the crevice, Fleet Black greeted him with a shrill whinny that echoed around and around the towering canyon walls and finally faded into stillness again. Voldar went to the black and placed his hands on the animal's neck. The softness of the hair and the warmth of the animal never failed to thrill the boy. As he let his hands slide to the sturdy back, he remembered the times he had sat there, traveling at such great speed. "Oh, Fleet Black," he said, "we belong together, and Jantan has promised that none shall take you from me. But there will be others who want to separate us. Perhaps this will be the last time I see you as my own." Fleet Black's answering nicker seemed to the youth an understanding one. With decision, Voldar at last attached the lines to the sides of the braided bridle. The tether was removed from Fleet Black's neck. The black pranced when he felt the boy leap to his back. There was a proudness now in his carriage, and he held his head high. He knew that they would soon be running wildly with the wind. Voldar held him back for a moment. Reaching down, he caressed the arching neck. He was trying to prepare himself and Fleet Black for the test, the outcome of which would mean so much to both of them. Then the boy guided the eager stallion out of the secret canyon and back over the trail which he had recently traveled alone. At the caves, the people were busy with preparations for the feast. The big fire was leaping and crackling now, fed with many logs. Later, these would turn to hot embers just right to roast the food. Huge pieces of meat were being bound to poles for turning when the coals were ready. Jantan directed the people in their tasks. Everything was being done in an orderly fashion, but Jantan's thoughts were constantly of Voldar. His ears were alert for sounds that might come from the direction in which the boy had disappeared. Frequently, his eyes looked toward the distant cliffs. As time passed, Jantan worried. Has the boy, after all, dreamed the things of which he spoke? He questioned himself. If he did speak the truth, how has it been possible for a boy to capture one of the fleet ones when the older hunters have failed? How can Voldar return to the fleet one each day? What strange power does the boy possess to keep the animal in one place? One thought puzzled Jantan more than the rest. If Voldar had spoken the truth and he could ride upon the back of the fleet one, with what strange power did the boy control the wild one so that he could bring the animal to this place? The keener ears of the aged mare first heard the approach of Voldar and the black. Her ears pointed in the direction of the gray cliffs. Jantan was next to hear it. Then the other hunters heard the sound. A puzzled look came upon their faces. No one spoke, for in the next moment a strange sight came into the distant view, the like of which no man had ever seen before. Many shielded their eyes to see more plainly. As the mounted boy drew rapidly nearer, fear took hold of all except Jantan, who rejoiced within himself as he saw the words of Manos fulfilled. Voldar had paid no attention to anything but the stallion. The black's hard hoofs pounded the stone surface of the trail. Vaguely, Voldar could hear the rocky pellets falling in showers behind them. Fleet Black's nostrils flared wide with nervousness. Never before had Voldar guided him over this strange trail. Instinctively, he feared the closeness of the cliffs. He felt more at home running on the open plain below. Even Voldar's strong arms controlled him with difficulty. The instant the stallion sensed the tribesmen, all his former fear of human beings gripped him. Drawing his powerful haunches under him, he slithered to a stop. Frantically, he shook his head when Voldar tried to urge him forward. His mane writhed upward wildly as he reared, trying to whirl and go back. His scuffling hind feet pushed rocks from the trail and started them rolling and bounding downward. Up, higher he stood, trying to escape the hunters and their spears. Then, to Voldar's horror, he bolted from the trail and plunged downward into the loose shale rock, which sloped steeply to the plain below. Voldar feared that the stallion would not be able to keep his feet. The unusual angle of the animal's body and the violently threshing legs threatened to unseat the boy. Loosened boulders from above whizzed past Voldar's head as they bounced on their way to the plain. He realized it would have been wise to leap from the back of Fleet Black and slide to safety by himself, but he clung grimly to the black mane. From the dizzy height, the pair lunged and slipped, carrying with them an avalanche of small stones. At last, the fleet one reached the safety of the flat plain at the foot of the great incline. When his feet struck the familiar flat land, he pranced and tossed his head as if in triumph. Then, with his tail held high, he ran swiftly out onto the plain that he loved so much. Voldar glanced back once over his shoulder. In that brief moment, he could see that the curious people were streaming down onto the plain from the cliffs above. Only once before had Voldar felt such power under him as he rode the galloping fleet one, when he had first captured him. On and on they went until the boy could feel the wetness of the animal's sides against his legs. He was content to let the great black go unchecked while he regained his breath. He would have to let Fleet Black use up a part of his energy so that he could control him more easily later. The boy hoped to turn him back for their meeting with the tribespeople. Now only slightly, he pulled the left sideline. The fast-running stallion began to circle far to the east before turning back toward the place at the edge of the plain where the people would gather. Gradually, Fleet Black forgot the fear that had made him plunge down the rocky slope. His stride lengthened and became more rhythmic. Voldar could tell that he was enjoying the run over the familiar ground. The boy, too, relaxed, and his mind turned once more to his meeting with the people of the tribes. He wondered what Jantan now thought of his story. It was fortunate that the headstrong stallion had left the rocky trail. The flatness of the plain was a better place to show his handling of the fleet one. Now that the time had come to show Fleet Black to the tribes, Voldar still did not feel ready. He wished that he could have had more time to train the wild fleet one. If he could control the stallion better, it would be easier to show the hunters the value of the fleet ones. Voldar and the Black had traveled far out onto the plain, and now as the boy looked back, the great cliffs towered up into the afternoon sky. He turned Fleet Black and guided him back to the place where Jantan waited. As he approached, many of the tribespeople were afraid and ran to hiding places along the huge boulders. Jantan stood nearer than the others. Voldar talked softly to the stallion and coaxed him toward the tall one. The stallion halted a few paces away. His red nostrils flared open. His sides moved rapidly in and out with his heavy breathing. His body trembled as he watched the hunters through the long strands of his wild forelock. The boy spoke first. "See, tall one," he said, "have I not spoken the truth?" Jantan walked slowly toward the pair. "You have indeed, Voldar," he said. "This day I shall remember as the one foretold by Manos." The black stallion pawed furiously with a nervous forefoot. Turning his back upon the two, Jantan faced the people. "Are there any among you who doubt that this is the sign of which Manos spoke?" he asked. Boljan strode forward. It was plain that he was angered by Jantan's suggestion. "Surely you joke, tall one," said the burly hunter. "This Voldar is not fit to lead men like us. He is but a youth." He moved ominously toward Voldar and the stallion. His words became angrier. "Are we to believe that this soft stripling is now to become our king, merely because he's able to sit upon the back of this timid creature that flees from his own shadow? Does not prove his leadership in my eyes. Let a man mount the fleet one in his place, and then I say you will have your king." Fleet Black watched the approaching hunter with increasing nervousness. His prancing hoofs rang on the rocks. Voldar was alarmed. "Stay, Boljan," he warned. "The Fleet One resents your approach. Do not tempt the lightning swiftness of his striking forefeet. Many times I have seen them kill." But Boljan was jealous of the boy. Stubbornly, he continued to move toward them. A hairy, muscular hand reached out to take hold of the cord that circled the Fleet One's neck. Voldar was nearly thrown from his seat, for in that instant the stallion screamed a warning and reared violently into the air. At the same time, he lashed out at Boljan with one forefoot. Voldar pulled hard upon the lines, and the Fleet One, thrown off his balance, was forced to swing away from the man standing below him. As his leg lashed out furiously, it barely missed Boljan, but hit his spear. The force of the blow ripped the weapon from the strong man's grasp, and it fell with such force that the stone point was driven deeply into the ground. The tribesmen gasped. Sick fear took the place of the arrogance on Boljan's once bold face. He cowered back to safety, leaving his spear behind. Next chapter, Voldar accepts the challenge. Voldar struggled to control Fleet Black. His anger mounted, not with the animal, but with the man. When he had quieted his mount, he spoke. "People of the tribes, I did not come here hoping to become your king. I do not wish to become the leader of the hunters. I would rather go now and not cause argument among the older men. My only purpose in writing to you is to prove the usefulness of the Fleet Ones. It is true that I am but a boy, yet to me the words of Manos hold great meaning." He raised his hand and made a large circle in the air. "In the short time you stood on this spot, I traveled with the speed of the wind a greater distance than a man's feet could cover from sunrise to sunset." Voldar reached down and pulled Boljan's spear from the ground. Whirling the black stallion, he poised the spear as though he were hunting and circled the tribe's people. His heels came sharply against the sides of Fleet Black, and the two charged away in a straight course. Voldar hurled the shaft, and it whistled through the air. The men of the clans were amazed at the speed and distance of its flight. When the boy brought the stallion back to the group, he called out to one of the men, "Tampar, you are the swiftest runner of all the tribes. Many times have you escaped the angry charge of the mammoth. You alone can drive your spear into the side of the stag as you run with him. Go now with all your swiftness to that point opposite the distant cliffs. I will stay here until you turn and start to run back. Then I will go also to the same place and return here before you." Voldar and the people waited anxiously as Tampar streaked toward the distant point. When he turned, he raised his hand as if to signal Voldar to start. The boy touched the stallion's sleek sides with his heels, and the great black leaped away. The power of his muscled legs carried him in great bounds toward the point where Tampar had turned. Each time that he reached out, a great distance was pushed behind him. The sun gleamed on his coat, and his long mane whipped in the wind at the turn. When they passed the running Tampar, it seemed as if he stood still. The people now looked at Voldar and the Fleet One with new interest. For the first time, they were beginning to realize the meaning of Manos's final message about their new leader. One of them talked excitedly to the others. "This is the most wonderful thing we have seen since the gift of the fire which Manos gave to us." "The Fleet One," said another, "carries his rider with the lightness of the wind and as swiftly as the flight of Hookbeak the eagle." An aged hunter agreed. "I look upon Voldar with envy. My old legs grow tired when I think of the great distances I have walked to discover better hunting fields. This boy could save his strength for the time of the battle with the mammoth." Until now, Jantan had stood back from the others. Though he was silent, he too had admired the way in which Voldar had handled the black. "No man before us has seen such a wonderful thing," he said now. "During the past days, we older ones have sought in vain to capture the Fleet Ones. Voldar has succeeded where we have failed. You may say Voldar is too young to lead us. I say that he has done the thing that Manos commanded." The tall one held up a hand, for someone began to protest. "I do not doubt that Voldar has the bravery and courage befitting a king," Jantan went on. "It would be difficult for us to understand the dreams of this young man, for we are fixed in our ways of hunting. With the Fleet One, Voldar offers a better way of life. Let us grasp for our use the gift of the Fleet Ones, which Voldar brings. I say that we should now accept Voldar as the head of all the tribes." Many of the people wished to do as Jantan suggested. Yet there were several of the older hunters who still doubted the youth's ability as a leader. One of these now spoke. "We must all admit that Voldar has shown great skill and courage this day, but still he is a boy who has not yet gained the experience which older men have." The old man pointed to Voldar. "I do not deny that he is able to do things that men on foot cannot do," he went on. "Yet his power is in the fleet one. Without the animal, he is again only a boy among us. See how he holds the black one lest it escape. How can we know that tomorrow's sun will not shine upon the empty back of the fleet one as Voldar looks upon him from afar off? The youth has no strange power that will bring the fleet one to him once the braid is not about his neck." Voldar did not answer the old man's words. There was truth in what the hunter said. Always the tether had held Fleet Black for him. Never had he risked untying the animal because of his fear that the stallion would leave him and return to the mares upon the plain. The animal was apparently obedient. He would halt when the word was spoken, but this had always been when Voldar was upon his back, or when he was holding the cord. The people waited, but still Voldar did not speak. He knew he must prove himself before them. He whirled the fleet one and rode a distance away. Then, dismounting, he stepped to Fleet Black's head and removed the cord that controlled him. Voldar and the people could see that the black trembled when he knew that he was free at last. The wind swept his black mane upward in long tufts, and he lifted his beautiful head loftily. Turning away from Voldar, he sniffed the breeze. Fleet Black was again a wild one. All eyes watched the black, and there was an unbroken silence. Suddenly, the stallion gave a shrill whistle and tossed his head joyfully. Then he started to run swiftly in the direction of the rocks, where the wild ones drank. Voldar's voice split the air with a single word. To the amazement of the people, the black slowed hesitantly and stopped. Then he turned and faced Voldar. As the boy slowly approached him, the black stallion was poised to run. His master continued toward him with outstretched hand. Voldar spoke now, so softly that the others could not hear. The black one pawed the ground, but stayed until Voldar was at his head again. The people saw the boy replace the restraining cord and leap to his back. In another instant, he had returned to where his tribesmen stood. They seemed unable to speak. Finally, Jantan broke the silence. "People of Manos, today you have seen a wonderful thing. Yesterday we did not know how to select a leader. Today Voldar has come riding upon the back of the fleet one, as Manos promised. More than that, you have witnessed the obedience of the animal to Voldar's command. You know by now that courage and bravery are strong in Voldar. Otherwise, he would not have been able to tame this wild creature. Yet I know that there are some among you who still feel that Voldar is only a child, who have no confidence in him as a leader." "You speak truthfully, Tall One," cried Boljan, still surly from his encounter with the stallion. "None of us has seen the bravery of this boy when face to face with fierce beasts. He bears no scars of hunting such as we bear. He has not stood shoulder to shoulder with the able hunters of our tribes. Never has he stood in the path of the hunted, angry, woolly mammoth. Never has he hurled a spear at Longtooth the lion. Our leader must be wise in the ways of hunting. I say let Voldar try his hand at grown-up things before we make him a king." While the hairy Boljan spoke, Jantan looked thoughtful. Turning to Voldar, who still sat upon the restless black, he said, "Voldar, I know that you have no desire to become a leader of the tribes. I do not know that I should ask you to risk danger, but you hear the challenge. Have you, Voldar, the courage to accompany the huntsmen on their next journey for food?" Voldar answered firmly, "Yes, but I must request one thing." "And what is that?" asked Jantan. "I will go," replied Voldar, "if I am permitted to hunt from the back of Fleet Black." There was some grumbling among some of the men at the boy's request. They felt that the stallion would be in the way of the expert spear throwers. But it was Jantan who decided. "You will be permitted to take the stallion with you, Voldar. When the sun has set this day and risen once again and set, preparations will be completed for the journey to the land of mammoths. The huntsman will go forth from this spot just before dawn of the day following tomorrow." "Fleet Black and I will be ready," said Voldar. Spurts of dust arose from the ground as he whirled the stallion and galloped away toward the gray cliffs and his hidden valley. Next chapter, Jantan's Gifts. Voldar did not sleep in his cave that night or the next. Not daring to leave the stallion alone, He went to his cave and brought back a huge animal fur. He would sleep in the canyon with Fleet Black. He knew that some of the hunters were jealous. Now they could easily follow the tracks. He was afraid that they might find the hidden canyon. Sleep did not visit Voldar until half the night had passed. He knew that there were many things to do before going to the land of mammoths. To hunt the huge beast with the fleet one was a new method. He went over and over in his mind the way in which he could fight the woolly one. Voldar was not sure that he and the Black were ready, but the promise had been made. Voldar watched the stars that twinkled coldly down at him for a long time before he slept. The sun had not yet risen the next morning when he crawled from his warm fur bed. The air was cold and frosty. The youth shivered as he gathered grass for Fleet Black's morning meal. While the stallion ate, Voldar hurried back to his cave. When he returned again, he carried a great spear. Today he must train the fleet one in the ways of battle. All that day, Voldar and the Black practiced. The animal would gallop rapidly toward a tree, and then as the boy hurled the spear, he would turn the Black sharply away. This was done many times until the spear always fell in the exact spot at which Voldar aimed. The rider guided his mount over rough rocks, up and down steep hills, in and out through trees and brush. The animal obeyed the slightest shifting of the boy's weight in making turns. When commanded, he stopped immediately. Then he would be away again when Voldar leaned over his neck and touched his sides. One thing troubled Voldar in his training of the Black. The stallion now obeyed every command. What will he do in actual battle, thought the boy. Voldar knew that the Black would be afraid and might not then obey the commands. Voldar now did a strange thing. First, he piled together a number of branches in a curious manner. Over these he placed the huge fur which had been his bed. The thing took form and resembled a wild beast. When Fleet Black was first ridden toward the ugly object, his instinctive fear of wild creatures caused him to snort in great dread. He plunged and reared in an attempt to whirl and run away from the imitation animal. The hand of Voldar held him. "Do not be afraid, Fleet Black," soothed the boy. "The thing cannot harm you." The boy's tone calmed the fleet one. Fleet Black did not understand the words, but he had learned to place confidence in the soft tones of the boy's voice. After the worst fear had passed, they practiced galloping straight toward the animal skin and veering away. Soon the Black seemed to realize it was only a game. Closer and closer he would approach at Voldar's bidding. The boy practiced hurling his spear at the thing. They galloped at it from every direction. Sometimes Voldar would throw to the side. At other times he turned on Fleet Black's back and made a difficult throw as they passed it. Always the pair worked as one. The fleet one apparently understood every movement of the boy. Each time Voldar threw the spear, his marksmanship grew better until at last it approached perfection. When the sun was setting, both the Black one and the boy were tired. Voldar led Fleet Black around and around until the animal's wet coat had completely dried. For he did not wish the dampness to stiffen the animal's muscles and make him lame. With dry grass, he then rubbed Fleet Black's body until the hair lay flat and shiny. Fleet Black had been watered at the small, trickling stream. Voldar was just putting down the last armful of grass when he heard the sound of a snapping twig beyond the barrier at the crevice. Quickly and silently, the boy went toward the opening. Climbing up by holding to the rough rocks, he reached a higher place. Voldar looked down. In the gathering darkness of the twilight, Voldar could dimly see the shape of a man. Then a hushed voice called out, "Voldar, are you here?" Voldar recognized the voice of Jantan. Why had the older man come here? He asked himself. He waited a moment in silence, then he answered, "Here, Jantan, look above you." After the tall one had helped the boy pull away the covering branches, they stood together in the smaller canyon. "I looked for you at your cave. Not finding you there, I tracked the stallion here," said Jantan. "This is indeed a good hiding place for the fleet one." Voldar was still curious to know why the man had come. "Have the plans of the hunt been changed?" he asked. "Why do you seek me?" Jantan removed his belt pouch and untied the thong which closed it. Then he placed its contents in Voldar's hands. Lying there were two of the most perfect spearheads that Voldar had ever seen. Made of the hardest black flint, their points were extremely sharp. The tall one said, Voldar, take these as a gift from me. They are perfect in their shape. Zulin, the flint worker, has never shaped any finer stones than these. Feel the hardness of their points and look at the expert workmanship of their hilts. When they are bound to the shaft, they cannot turn or become loose. Voldar turned the flints over and over in his hands. Their smoothness was pleasant to his touch. You are very good to me, Jantan, he said. I have faith in you, Voldar. I believe you to be the fulfillment of the dream of Manos. Only with your guidance, Jantan. You can be sure of my help so long as we both live, replied the tall one. Then Jantan spoke of other things. The preparations for the journey are complete. Are you ready to leave before dawn? Yes, I go now to my cave to gather food. I will sleep here again tonight with the fleet one. The older man walked with Voldar back to his cave. Before they separated, Jantan placed his hand on the boy's shoulder. Pay no heed to the jibes of the other hunters. They do not yet realize the value of the fleet ones. I know that you will be able to prove it to them. Goodbye, then, until tomorrow. As Jantan walked away in the darkness, Voldar entered his cave. He took a hollow stone filled with moss from the ledge where it lay. Placing it upon the earth floor, he struck the fire flints rapidly over it. A small flame burst up from the moss, which was soaked in animal oil, lighting the cave. Many times Voldar had watched the older men make ready for the hunt. Extra sinews were placed in the pouch with the 2 spearheads of Zulin. These were to bind the sharp flints to the shafts. 2 long shafts were laid aside. These were made from the straightest pieces of wood that could be found. They had first been shaped with cutting axes made of stone. Later, they had been scraped and polished. Voldar pushed one through his clasped hand. Its smoothness squeaked against the pressure. The oil from the many hands that had thrown it had filled the pores of the wood, polishing it so that it now glinted in the light when Voldar moved it. Only one of the shafts with the stone head attached would be carried when the hunt was in progress. After laying all the hunting weapons out, Voldar turned to the task of packing food. This was simple. The food consisted only of a quantity of dried meat, strips, and roots and nuts. These would be his only food for the next few days. Into 2 bags made of the skin of an antelope, Voldar placed his rations. The meat went into one, and the roots and nuts went into the other. Most of the hunters would be able to only carry 1 pouch full of food. Because they traveled on foot, it would not be possible to carry many things. And Voldar fastened the 2 bags together in a curious fashion. He planned to sling them over the back of Fleet Black, and so relieve himself of their burdensome weight. The next day, he was looked upon with envy by the older huntsmen because of this. As a final touch of preparation, the boy placed the old, familiar coiled braid over one shoulder and stuck the handle of a sharp stone axe into the thong around his waist. When these things were done, he picked up the spear shafts and pouch of spearheads in one hand and the food bags in the other, and made his way back to Fleet Black's canyon, where Fleet Black greeted him with a snicker. Next chapter, The Hunt. The bulky forms of many muscular men were gathering in the early morning darkness. Soon the rising sun would begin to color the highest crags of the cliffs. The cold gray of the rocks would change to brilliant orange. Savage power and stealth showed in their stride as the men moved about. The cold of the morning chilled their bodies, and they walked to keep warm. These were the mightiest hunters of all the tribes. Many of them were scarred from battles with the wild beasts that they had hunted. Impatience showed on their dark, heavy brows. They were anxious to start, and the boy was not there. Some of them began to make fun of him. Jeeringly, one of them called out, "Where is the mighty hunter Voldar and his fleet one? Is the morning too chilly for him to arise from his warm bed of furs?" "Yes," joked another. "During the night, his dreams of woolly mammoth have caused his mind to change. Perhaps he does not now wish to risk the dangers which accompany a king." It was the serious voice of Jantan which answered. "Do not joke at one who has so much to offer you," he said. "If your mouths did not make so much noise, your ears could hear the sound of hoofs, harder than the horn of the stag, upon the rocky trail high above you." A few moments later, as the still hidden sun began to form a glow behind the eastern mountains, the boy and the fleet one rode among them. Jantan gave the command, and the men slowly trudged out across the plain, facing into the red sun. Fleet Black was fresh and eager. He fretted at being held to such a slow pace. At times, Voldar let him run on ahead to stretch his legs, and then held him while the men caught up again. The hunting party moved steadily all morning toward the lofty mountains in the distance. Beyond was a land of lush green pastures where the great mammoths, elk, and bison grazed. It was a higher land than the ancient plain upon which they now traveled. When the sun was directly above them, the men stopped and sat in the grass. They had traveled more than half the distance to the mountains. They ate a sparing meal while they rested. Resuming march again, the huntsmen continued until they began to climb upward into the mountains. While it was yet light, the men made a camp. A great fire was built to frighten away the beasts that roamed in the night, and the men took turns to see that the flames were kept bright. This was a strange land to Voldar. He had always wanted to visit these mountains that looked so blue from his cliffs. Never had he seen trees that grew to such height. As he lay on his bed of boughs, it seemed to Voldar that their tops almost brushed the stars. Strange birds gave soft cries, and the last thing that Voldar heard was the lonely sighing of the wind in the treetops above him. Then he slept. Voldar was up early with the rest of the men. He took Fleet Black to the bottom of a leafy canyon where a sparkling stream rushed down. The stallion walked out into the stream and drank with his nose deep in the rushing, frothy water. Voldar lay upon a large flat stone and drank too. The water was icy cold and good to the taste. Youth and animal were refreshed. Again, as the sun was rising, the men left their camp and started down into a beautiful land. Green meadows spread out before them. Voldar noticed many small lakes. Surrounding the lakes were luxuriant trees growing thickly on the shores. Slowly they went down, down. They were now in the land of the great mammoths. Voldar noticed a wariness creep into the faces of the hunters. They feared this great woolly monster, which they were forced to fight to avoid starvation. All knew the danger of his ferocious charge, and a few had felt the pain of his slashing tusks. There was a strange excitement in the heart of Voldar. Many times had he seen the broken bodies of men who had lost the battle to the woolly one. Fleet Black, too, was nervous. He was in a strange land, and his sensitive nostrils warned him of the hostile beasts that lived here. As the group moved out onto the lower land, many herds of tiny antelope leaped away in fright. The hunters might have taken some of these creatures, but they wasted neither their spears nor their strength on such small game. Deeper and deeper they penetrated into the land of the lakes, following the wooded shores. When the sun had reached its highest point in the sky, Jantan motioned the men to halt. Then for a while they sat in the shade of the giant trees to eat and rest. When the meal was finished, Voldar noticed a change in the hunters. Jantan spoke to those who had gathered around him. "O mighty hunters, as you all know, we are now in the heart of the land of the woolly ones." They all nodded in silence, and then one of the men spoke. "Yes, tall one, we have all noticed the signs of the great beasts. The grass is crushed, the leaves of the trees have been stripped higher than 3 times the height of our tallest hunters." "We must go forward with great caution," said another, "for we do not know when we may come face to face with the mammoth." Voldar listened intently to the conversation and the plans of the older men. Though he trembled inwardly with excitement, he spoke calmly. "Jantan, may I say something concerning the plans you now make?" Jantan nodded his consent. "It is my thought to save the strength of the men for the battle," said the boy. "The legs of the stallion can cover the ground quickly and tirelessly. Let me seek the ugly animal while you rest here." At this point, Buljan, the unfriendly hunter, interrupted the boy. "And what will you do, boy," he asked, "when you find the woolly one? Do you intend to creep up behind him and prick him into greater ferocity with the puny strength of your spear arm?" Jantan was agitated by the man's remarks, but said nothing to him. Gazing at Voldar with grave confidence, he said, "Continue, Voldar. What is the rest of your plan?" The boy continued, "When I have sighted the woolly one, I will look closely at the land surrounding him. Then I will return here again. In this way, we can decide just how to attack the animal." Jantan approved and said, "It is a good plan, Voldar. Go now, and we shall await your return." Before mounting, Voldar removed the food bags from the back of the black. As he rode away, he carried no weapons, for he wished to travel with as little weight as possible. Soon the boy and the fleet one were out of sight of the hunters. The pair was alone in a land of foreboding strangeness. The forest formed dense walls of greenery. Broad, grassy meadows stretched away from the line of trees. Voldar felt small in this vast land of the mammoths. He knew that the animals which roamed here were unbelievably huge and ferocious. Cautiously, he guided Fleet Black along the path at the edge of the vivid green forest. Each time they came to a curve in the path, he stopped the black to listen intently. He knew the mammoth's habit of feeding upon the leaves at the edge of the forest. He did not wish to blunder clumsily into sight of one of the great beasts. Suddenly, Voldar felt the muscles of Fleet Black stiffen. At the same moment, the animal stopped and stood as if frozen. His ears were carried intently forward. He had smelled danger ahead. Voldar heard the underbrush crackle, and then two black wolves bounded out into the meadow. They were of enormous size. Coarse hair stood up from their shoulders. Their cruel green eyes and long fangs made the boy shudder. The stallion strained to whirl and run, but Voldar held him. The boy knew that the black ones could not smell him and the stallion because the wind was in the wrong direction. Apparently they were on the hot scent of some unlucky creature. With their noses close to the ground, they did not see the boy and the fleet one. It was with relief that Voldar watched them run out across the grassland in swift pursuit of the animal they hunted. The hoofs of the stallion made no sound as they continued along the grassy path. Soon they came to a small stream. The water was filled with boulders which had been uncovered by the stream on its outward journey from the lake which fed it. Voldar did not want to risk taking Fleet Black through the rocks. The tread of the flinty hoofs would be dangerously loud. Instead of crossing there, they turned and went downstream. Finally, they reached a place where the water was shallow, and the stream had a sandy bottom. Voldar turned Fleet Black, and they waded through it. Starting back upstream to return to the edge of the forest, Voldar saw a gigantic brown form slashing and pulling at the leaves of the trees high above its head. The stallion snorted in alarm, but the beast continued to tear at the trees. It seemed to be concerned with nothing but its ravenous appetite. The branches swayed and snapped as the long, curling trunk of the mammoth stripped the foliage from them. Voldar stared in awe at the ugly brute. This was the first time he had seen one of the animals alive. He studied the long, curving tusks. Great patches of wool covered the massive shoulders and the top of the ugly head. Longer brown hairs grew out of the wool all over the body. The animal seemed to tower to a great height in front. The powerful legs and underparts of the body were heavily encrusted with dried mud. The great weight of the animal had caused it to wallow in the soft earth bordering streams. The sounds that the animal made were as hideous as his appearance. He grunted in deep tones, and Voldar could hear his huge jaws grinding and smacking the leaves and twigs that he ate. When he moved, his great feet made horrible sucking noises in the soft ground. This was the great beast that the hunters must fight. He knew now why the men were afraid of the mammoth. The mere sight of such an animal was enough to strike fear into the heart of the bravest hunter. Carefully, Voldar looked around him. He memorized the position of the trees and the stream. He made a mental picture of the animal's position at the forest's edge. He must be able to describe to the hunters the exact location of everything so that they could plan the attack. Then the boy quietly turned Fleet Black downstream again and rode him away from the place. He was anxious to get out of sight before the animal saw him. When a considerable distance was between them, Voldar let the black gallop rapidly back along the trail. Last chapter, Voldar wins. The men listened intently to Voldar as he described what he had seen since he left them. He told about the two huge wolves that had leaped out of the forest. He explained how he had finally reached the stream and followed it some distance before crossing through it. A fearful look crept over the faces of the brawny hunters when Voldar told them about the woolly beast and his enormous size. One of the hunters muttered, "It sounds as if the boy describes Old Hairy One. His countless seasons of life have given him great size and strength." Another hunter spoke his knowledge of Old Hairy One. "Yes, he rules the forest, and no animal dares dispute him," he exclaimed. If it is he, we shall have a fierce battle." "He has felt the pain of spear points before," said another. "I have seen him kill many hunters. He is wise. I do not know that we can kill him." Jantan, the tall one, could see that the men were talking themselves into greater fear. "Voldar, having been over the land surrounding the animal we seek, have you any plan that might help us in our attack?" he asked. Instead of immediately answering, Voldar pulled up the grass from a patch of ground. After he had smoothed the bare dirt, he drew a map with his finger. "Not far from here," he said, "is another thick forest. I followed the edge of it along here. I stayed on the south side because the wind came from the north." He continued drawing the map. After showing them the place where he had seen the wolves, he drew a picture of the stream that came from within the forest. "It was at this point that I turned and followed the bank of the stream," he said. As he talked, he traced upon the map the paths that he had followed. He drew a line at the place where he had turned Fleet Black through the water. "I rode only a short distance back toward the forest when I saw the mammoth feeding. It was here beyond this bend at the edge of the forest." Voldar marked the spot on his map with a cross. "My plan," he explained, "is for us to go along the path I followed until we reach the point where I saw the black ones. At this place, I think we should separate. You should go through the forest until you find the woolly one. I will ride Fleet Black out into the meadow where I can approach the beast from behind to make him turn. In that way, it will be possible for you to surprise him from the forest side." Jantan seemed proud of the way in which the boy had laid the plans. "It is good," he said. "We will start now." The huntsmen hurriedly selected their best spears. Their food pouches they hung high in the branches, out of reach of hungry animals. While they were busy with these tasks, Voldar took one of the beautiful Zulan spearheads from the pouch at his belt. Selecting the straighter of his two shafts, he bound the flint head securely to one end, using the thin, tough sinews of Flathorn the deer. As the hunters went single file along the pathway, it was Voldar and the Black who pointed out and led the way. In a short time, they reached the point where they had decided to separate. "When you are in the forest, continue in the same direction until you come to the stream," Voldar directed, "and there, beyond the bend in the forest, you will find the woolly one." When he had finished speaking, Voldar turned the stallion away from the forest, and the men disappeared silently into it. The youth talked in soothing tones to Fleet Black, for he noticed that the stallion now recognized and feared the place where they had seen the hideous mammoth earlier. Though he was nervous, Fleet Black obeyed every command that Voldar gave him. He seemed to place confidence in the boy in spite of the great danger. In the forest, the men stealthily followed Jantan, making not the slightest sound. Soon they had reached the stream that Voldar had described. This they crossed, leaping from one slippery stone to the next. They went on until they reached the curve in the forest. Here they stopped. It was at this moment that they heard the noise of cracking branches. They knew that the mammoth was near. Their feet made no sound as they crept slowly toward the meadow where they knew they must do battle. Jantan was the first to reach the edge of the meadow. Carefully, he parted the low-hanging branches. Looking through the dense underbrush, he saw the ugly beast which they sought. The men were right. It was Old Hairy One. The mammoth grunted hideously as his jaws chewed at the enormous mouthfuls of leaves and twigs which he stripped from the branches with his trunk. His small reddish eyes continuously searched for more to eat. Jantan saw all this in a moment. Then he turned to look across the meadow for sight of the boy. Over the top of the tall, swaying grass, Jantan soon sighted Voldar and the Black. They were approaching Old Hairy One from the other side. Jantan did not call out. He dared not alarm the beast and spoil their plan. Instead, he raised one arm to Voldar. Immediately, the watchful boy saw him and returned the signal. This was a sign that all was in readiness for the attack. Voldar leaned forward and pressed his heels against the stallion's side. Galloping straight toward Old Hairy One, the boy shouted wildly. The woolly one trumpeted a startled blast that resounded through the forest. Ponderously, he whirled his great body and faced the boy and the fleet one. Voldar slowed the stallion's speed when the huge beast began walking out to meet him. With his trunk raised high, the mammoth blasted his challenge. The ground seemed to tremble with the force of it. This was what the hunters wanted. If the beast could be lured away from the forest's edge, it would give them a chance to come out without being seen. Quickly they would steal up behind from in the tall grass and surround the beast. Voldar, but not the mammoth, saw the hunters creep out of the forest and crouch low in a semicircle around their prey. Every spear was poised to kill. Then one of the hunters who was nearest the huge animal's side raised his mighty arm and made the throw. The aim was too high. The spear sank into the flesh at the top of the animal's shoulder. A bellow of pain shook the ground upon which the hunter stood. Quickly the ugly beast turned, seeking to cut down his tormentor. The grass was trampled flat. Hunters scrambled in all directions. The beast, in spite of his great size, seemed to be everywhere in his ferocious charges after the men. Voldar and the Black went into action again. He sought to attract Old Hairy One away from the men. Voldar yelled and galloped the stallion straight toward the huge beast. The sound of the boy and the pounding hoofs caused the beast to whirl and face them again. Dangerously near they came this time. The fleet Black veered away just as a tusk was thrust toward him in a wicked curving arc. It came so close that it almost touched the Black's side. The enraged mammoth plunged after them. Bellowing loud, he tried to destroy the nimble-footed stallion and his rider. The onrush of the charge carried them near the stream bed. The hunters quickly followed. Several hurled their spears. Most of the great stone points missed their mark, but one penetrated a leg muscle. An instant later, another struck crazily into the infuriated animal's side. The fight was not going well for the men. In order to kill, the spear must strike the vital spot in the massive chest. The struggle now took the men and the beast in and out of the stream. The water first turned red from the animal's wounds, then black from the churned mud. First one hunter and then another would be singled out for the savage whirling thrusts of the curving ivory tusks. If a hunter had slipped or fallen, he surely would have been smashed into the earth by the maddened woolly one. Each time the beast raced after a man, Voldar and the gallant Black would gallop straight toward the bulky brown shape until it towered high above them. Each time, Fleet Black would turn away just in time to save them. Though the excitement was great, Voldar marveled at the way Fleet Black performed. The stallion showed more courage than the boy had previously thought possible. The hard muscles under the wet black coat rippled in perfect control. He seemed to know every move that the mammoth would make. Voldar scarcely needed to guide him as he dashed in, stopped short, and circled in rapid strides. The men also began to notice the brilliant teamwork of the two. The pair worked as one. Each time a hunter was saved from a vicious, bellowing onslaught, a shout of approval went up from the men. The boy and the stallion seemed to give them new hope. But as the battle went on, the men grew tired. Their races away from the mammoth were not so swift and sure as before. Many of them stayed back, too exhausted to fight any longer. It was Boljan, the swarthy one, who finally made a valiant effort to deliver the fatal thrust. Stepping dangerously near, he aimed his spear into the huge animal's heart. His muscles bulged as he drove the heavy weapon. For a moment it seemed as though the stone head would go true. Then a sharp crack was heard. The spear had glanced off the thick tusk at its base. Too late, Boljan started to flee. His feet struck a slippery rock. He went down in the muddy stream bed. The snorting monster was almost upon him. His blood-red eyes flashed hate at the helpless man. With his head lowered, he was about to grind the man into the mud. The great-backed stallion started at a full running stride as he felt Voldar's heels press into his sides. Into the stream bed in one long leap, he soared as Voldar poised his spear. The huntsmen who had feared for Boljan's life were now frozen in amazement at the daring of Voldar's drive. Straight on toward the woolly one they came. It seemed as though they would gallop into the very tusks of the beast. This time, instead of turning away, the fleet one and the boy drove face to face with the great brown hulk. As Voldar came up to the massive chest, he was seen to hurl his spear, and then they went past. The rushing speed of Fleet Black had caused Zulan's heavy stone head to sink straight and deep to the heart. Before any hunter could think to hurl another spear, Old Hairy One sank heavily to the mud. The battle was won. The mammoth was dead. The men stood in silence. They did not know what to say. Finally, it was Jantan, the wise tall one, who spoke. "O brave hunters, you have seen a wonderful thing this day. Buljan has been snatched from the very jaws of death by the hand of Voldar. If any one of you has voice to dispute the courage of Voldar, let him now speak." Every man remained silent, as if ashamed of the ridicule he had heaped upon the boy. At last Voldar himself broke the silence. "I am glad that the life of Buljan has been spared," he said. "Without the Fleet One, it would not have been possible. I did not come with you on this journey hoping to make of myself a king. I hoped only to prove the value of the Fleet Ones to our people. Since the days that I was a young boy, I have been fascinated by the Fleet Ones. Always I have loved to observe their nimble swiftness." The men no longer looked upon Voldar as a boy. They listened intently to every word he said. Voldar continued, "It is true that I was a mere boy on the first day that the stallion carried me such a great distance from the big rocks. Since that time, I seem to feel strangely older. As I trained the Black One, I realized his value to the people of our tribes. I feel it is a duty to help the people gain for themselves this gift that can be ours. It will not be necessary for our people always to remain in the same worn-out hunting grounds. The Fleet Ones can carry our burdens to distant places. Into lush pastures and abundant hunting grounds we will travel. We will become nomads of many lands." He paused and drew breath. "I ask you now," questioned Voldar, "shall we keep this stallion and add to him his sons and his daughters? Or shall I leap from his back and free him forever?" The men who stood before Voldar knew that he spoke with the courage and wisdom of a man. He had proved his skill and courage this day. Not one could deny that the boy was a worthy successor to Manos. They all raised their voices in loud approval. Jantan smiled, well pleased, for he had full confidence in Voldar, and at last the will of Manos had been fulfilled. The seasons passed more easily for the people of Voldar. As the youthful king had promised, life for the primitive race was made better. Voldar's tribes became known as the people of the Fleet Ones. The name of Voldar grew to greatness. He was respected for his bravery and wisdom. Voldar instructed the young men in the ways of training the Fleet Ones. He led them to distant fields of hunting. When they hunted, Voldar and Fleet Black, the magnificent stallion, always led the others. With the passing of the years, so too passed the wild black stallion and his mares. Later, Voldar and the men who mastered them also passed, but their descendants and the descendants of the Fleet Ones still work and play together in mutual companionship. The end.